today? Hello everyone, how's your day? I hope you're doing good. Basically, today is really hot, but it's okay because we're having this meeting right now. Okay, I will do this myself. I am Aditya Labdakanuska from Vocational High School 7 Semarang as your host today. So today, we're gonna have a meeting with a topic podcast versus radio. It sounds like a battle, right? Okay, so without further ado, I will hand this meeting over to Kalista as today's moderator.
Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, I am Kalista Naira Suyanto Putri as moderator on this webinar. Thanks for joining to this webinar. So today, webinar is we want to talk about radio versus podcast. So our presenter this afternoon is Dhivia Almira Zahra. You can call her Dhivia. Dhivia is student from 7 Vacation High School in Semarang. She is in grade 10 from KCIJ 1. So without any longer, let's start this webinar. So Dhivia.
Okay, thanks, Tata. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and how have you all been? Of course, I hope you're all doing good, though. Okay, then, my friend Sangha will share the screen for me. Nice. And I'm going to explain the material I've prepared for today's webinar, which is about radio and podcast. Okay, next slide, Rangga. Yeah, in here, we're about to know what's inside this PowerPoint first. At the first part, we have the definition of radio and the definition of podcast. And also we also have the differences between these two. And there's also a little history of podcast and radio in Indonesia. And then the benefits of radio and podcast in daily life. And the last one is the advantages that is access between radio and podcast. Okay, so let's get to the first part. Next slide, Rangga. Which is about the definition of radio. So basically, radio is a technology used to send signals using radiation generated by electromagnetic waves. Or more easily, we can say that radio has a working system that relies on radio waves as a signal source. And then the medium used to send the radio waves is called an antenna. Later, these radio waves will be converted by radio sets into a mean capable of carrying information or broadcast. Well, this is what I will try to explain in this presentation, which is about radio broadcasting. According to Undang-Undang Nomor 32 Tahun 2002, radio broadcasting is described as a listening mass communication medium which transmits ideas and information in the form of sound in general and open manner in the form of regular and continuous program. Well, that was a short explanation about radio, and now we're moving on to the next slide. Next slide, yeah. Which is about the definition of podcast. Podcast is the result of an audio recording that can be implemented at any time and can be heard by the general public through various existing electronic media. However, nowadays podcasts can be enjoyed not only in audio but also in video. You can find podcasts like that on YouTube because there are so many, there are a lot of them there. And podcasts on YouTube are not only audio, but also feature videos that can be watched at any time by anyone because they are not a live broadcast like radio. Okay, next slide. We're about to know the between those two. Well, the main difference between radio broadcast and podcast lies in the technical manufacture. Podcast can be recorded, edited, or entered into a post-production, while radio is live broadcast. Yeah, although there are several radio segments that were recorded beforehand, radio broadcasting hasn't gone through an editing process. And the second difference between radio and podcast lies in the broadcast concept. Radio is usually broadcast live with a predetermined broadcast schedule, such as television broadcasts. Radio broadcasts are also limited by geographic boundaries and cannot be played anymore because radio channel can only be reached in their respective areas, while podcasts can be listened to at any time. They can even be downloaded so listeners can replay it without any hassle. And the third one, the difference between those two lies in the serving of content. Podcasts are an on-demand service which allows listeners to listen to content they just want to hear or even download specific episodes as they see fit. Meanwhile, radio has a scheduled broadcast time. Listeners who don't want to listen to content on one radio channel will switch to another radio channel. And the differences between those two lies in the topic. Um, when listening to the radio, listeners tend to listen to one of their favorite radio channels. Radio provides music content, political discussion, health, education, various reviews, and even culinary delights. While podcasts only discuss one topic and their content is more specific in one channel, what is presented is also a unique topic and is rarely discussed. There are podcasts that specifically discuss various kinds of type. There are also podcasts that discuss personal experiences. There are special podcasts to discuss horror stories even to the point of outpouring. So podcast content can be enjoyed at any time according to listeners' interest. And the fifth one, the differences between those two lies in broadcast time and duration. In radio broadcasts, broadcasters have limited time. This is because the radio has many time topics, so it is necessary to divide the time in each broadcast. Radio also has its own mix in an event, such as musical compositions, news, advertisement, interviews, or phone sessions with listeners, which are not on the podcast. That's why radio broadcasters always introduce themselves, radio stations and channels are also the topic being discussed when changing segments. Meanwhile, podcasters can define their own podcast format. Podcasts also do not have broadcast time because the concept of broadcasting is freer or doesn't depend on any situation. Podcast broadcasters are also free to determine the broadcast time and duration of each episode as desired. And the last differences between those two lies on the target audience. Radio tends to a Radio tends to target a broad audience by creating a wide variety of content on a variety of topics so that listeners can stick with the channel. Contrary to that, podcasts try to target a narrower audience based on a focus on a more individual topic. Okay, that was the explanation of some differences between radio and podcast. Now we're moving on to the next slide, which is a little history of radio in Indonesia. The history of world radio began in 1920 in the United States. The history of radio in Indonesia itself began 5 years later on July 16, 1925. Indonesia, which was still called Hindia Belanda at that time, established its first radio broadcast on July 16, 1925, and 1925 called Batavia Radio Vereniging or PRV in Batavia or Jakarta in the past. During the Dutch colonial period, radio stations operating were were what is it? Were privately owned. Meanwhile, during the Japanese colonial period, the government and existing private radio broadcasts, various broadcast programs were we used to spread propaganda for the Perang Asia Timur Raya. Broadcast radio also has a very important role in spreading the text of the proclamation to all Indonesian people and the world. Next slide. A little history of podcast in Indonesia. The podcast comes from the words iPad and broadcasting. Podcast is originally only designed to be used on Mac and iPad. In Indonesia, podcast began in 2005 when a person named Boy Afrianto created a podcast for the first time with the name Apa Saja Podcast in the Blogspot entry. The presence of SoundCloud 3 years later as an application that can use to make and listen to podcasts more easily makes podcasts increasingly recognized by the Indonesian public. In 2015, Indonesian podcasters began to appear. A famous example at that time was Iqbal Haryadi with podcast Subjective. Then there's Adriano Colby with the podcast Awal Minggu since 2016, and there's also Ernie Hotfield with Suarane in 2017. Okay, next slide. We have benefits of radio in daily life. First is auditive in nature. Because as we know that radio focuses its consumers on listening rather than reading ability, it makes it easier for people who can't read and write to get information. And then learn to listen. By listening to the radio, we learn to focus on what we hear, because broadcasts on radio cannot be replayed. In fact, it's not enough just to listen, but also need to understand and appreciate. And then adding insight. Although it can only be accessed via voice, those broadcasts by radio are as complete as those broadcasts on television, newspaper, and other mass media. And the news provided is also up-to-date news. And then also there's a place to talk to the listeners. The facilities also provided on radio channels are channels for sharing stories. You can tell something happy or sad here. Surely there will be solutions from broadcasters regarding what we are feeling. And then we can send greetings. Radio channels also provide a facility for sending greetings. We can send greetings to our relatives, school friends, work, and others. And then we can request songs. By requesting a song, the song we request will be played on the radio channel. Usually, the broadcaster will tell you a phone number that can be contacted for song request. And then we can find out information about music. This is what teenagers have been waiting for. From this feature, we will know the songs that are up to date, from famous songs to newly released songs. Usually, this broadcast is broadcast on Sunday. And then business promotion. For entrepreneurs, there's nothing wrong with doing promotions via radio. This method is quite effective even if it's only in the scope of the city or region. And then preserving culture. The traditional arts of a region are often broadcast via radio broadcast. Radio Republik Indonesia or RRI is one of the most familiar. RRI is very concerned with the local culture in which they are located. Artists are usually invited to show off their skills, even if only via voice. And the last one is entertainment while in the car. When driving a car, our eyes will certainly focus on the road so that the right entertainment and not distract us from driving is to turn on the radio. Next slide. We have the benefits of podcasts in daily life. First, it provides the same brain stimulation as reading a book. Listening to podcasts stimulates the brain to receive information in the same way reading books do. Listening to podcasts also stimulates the brain to produce clearer image in the mind much more quickly and easily than in book form. This makes listeners feel more interested in the story or narrative of the podcast. And then we got we got new knowledge. There are many podcasts that have discussion segments by presenting various experts. This means the information provided is not just opinions, but also facts. And then help develop yourself. There, there are many podcasts that can teach listeners about specific fields of study and careers. For example, podcasts that focus on creativity and technology like Supercharged and Back to Work, or podcasts that focus on UX design. And then giving inspiration. Most podcasts cover a variety of current topics from different perspectives, so you can understand the topic from multiple perspectives. Listening to these podcasts will stimulate listeners to be more critical, creative, and get interesting inspiration. And the last one is helping someone to be a good listener. Listeners can listen to podcasts. uh, I'm sorry, I mean as entertainment while working. Listeners can listen to podcasts while working. Podcasts have the benefit of being friends if you feel lonely while doing assignments, especially for work from home. And the last one, podcast is helping someone to be a good listener. Podcast allows listeners to be a part of what they're listening to, then stimulate different parts of the brain and encourage listeners to actively listen, especially if it's a topic of real interest. Next slide. We have the advantages that exist between radio and podcast. First, every radio broadcast always plays a song every day. In contrast to podcasts, which cannot just include songs in broadcast because they are bound by the copyright of the song owner. And the second one, radio channels are broadcast every day, different from podcasts, which are broadcast based on episodes. And the third one, podcasts can be heard over and over again, in contrast to radio, which can only be heard once because it's a live broadcast. And then depends on on the internet network. It contrasts to radio, which depends on the transmitter signal or receive frequency. Okay, it's not for me. Tata, you can take this again.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dhivia, for such information and interesting presentation. So now it's time to Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand and unmute your mic, and or you can type it in the chat field.
There's someone who already asked a question in chat.
Okay. Mr. Andreas, next question. Do you think that the radio is still relevant for now, and why?
Okay, I will answer the question. Yeah, I think that radio is still relevant for now because what is it? We can also get get many information from radio, like what we get, what we get in on television. So I think radio right now is also used to giving information, and also we can also get a lot of some recommendations on from radio. So that so I think that's why radio is still relevant from now, and it's not enough to call old because radio is also up to date. That's it for me. Is it answering your questions, sir?
Okay, it's actually you answered my question. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I have another question for you. Uh, is that true that the radio will be tergusur with them will be existed for years later? Thank you. I hope you understand what I say. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I understand about why your question, sir, but I'll answer it. But I'm sorry, I always kind of struggle whenever I speak English, so bear with me, please. Um, okay, I think that radio and podcasts are will still exist until many years after this, because what's it? Because because um because the amount, it's just the amount of the listeners that different. It's not about the quality or something. It's just about the amount of the listeners. I mean, people, most people right now is prefer radio over prefer podcast over radio. So I think it's just about the amount of the listeners that different. It's not about the quality of or something from radio or podcast that bad or was it or bad or something. It's just for me. It's just the listener, the amount of listener that different. That's it, sir.
Okay, thank you, Kak Divya. And another question. Uh, uh, could you tell me what I will membandingkan apa itu membandingkan? I will membandingkan
Comparing.
the comparing yes comparing between the radio and podcast between the YouTube ya. I could you tell me what the things that the radio or podcast listeners uh, Indonesia ya, apa yang bisa dilakukan oleh uh, what what the radio and podcast listeners that can do, apa yang bisa dilakukan oleh pengguna pendengar radio dan podcast yang tidak bisa dilakukan oleh penonton YouTube. That's it. Apa saja?
Ini
Thank you.
dijawab pakai bahasa Indonesia apa Inggris?
Dua-duanya boleh.
Oh, dua-duanya boleh.
Oke.
Saya
Ya.
jawab pakai bahasa Indonesia aja ya, Pak, biar nggak terlalu lama.
Ya. Oke. Agak
Menurut
lama juga
saya,
nggak apa-apa.
Enggak, nanti bingung kalau pakai bahasa Inggris nyusunnya kalimat gimana. Menurut saya, apa yang nggak bisa dilakukan penonton YouTube, apa yang penonton radio bisa lakukan tapi nggak bisa dilakukan oleh penonton YouTube gitu ya Pak?
Betul.
Ya,
Ya.
menurut saya itu lebih ke ini Pak, kan ada kalau di radio, kalau teman-teman semua atau Bapak sendiri sering dengerin radio itu, mereka selalu muterin musik setiap siaran. Nah, musiknya itu pun bermacam-macam kayak yang banyak banget setiap selesai musik satu di setelan musik yang lain dan kayak gitu terus menerus gitu loh. Sedangkan kalau di YouTube kita kan nggak bisa sembarangan pakai musik tuh kalau mau bikin radio, mau bikin video atau segala sesuatunya. Karena kan ada hak cipta atau yang biasa dikenal dengan copyright ya. Nggak semua lagu bisa didengarkan lewat nggak semua lagu bisa didengarkan di video-video YouTube karena ada copyright-nya harus harus itu loh harus harus mendengarkan lagu-lagu yang hanya berasal dari official channel yang membuat lagu tersebut. Jadi menurut saya yang bisa dilakukan oleh pendengar radio yang tidak bisa dilakukan oleh pendengar YouTube adalah saat mendengarkan musik di radio itu bisa lebih luas karena kita bisa bebas dengerin musik apa aja yang diputarin sama penyiar radionya daripada kita nyari-nyari di YouTube. Dan oh ya, di radio itu kita bisa mendapatkan itu loh, rekomendasi musik. Tapi kalau di YouTube kita harus nyari musik, kita harus mikir gitu loh, ini apa ya, aku pengen dengerin musik apa ya. Sedangkan kalau di radio itu kita justru yang mendapat rekomendasi mau mendengarkan musik apa gitu.
I think that's a good explanation for you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Any question again? Randa, maybe you want to ask question? Okay. Which one you prefer more between podcast or radio, and tell the reason why you choose that?
Okay, to be honest, I prefer radio. And the reason is very simple. It's because from radio I can get a lot of song recommendations, and I don't know why, but I just didn't find my interest in podcasts, even though most people nowadays is prefer podcast over radio, but I don't know why. I just didn't find my interest in podcasts. I don't even have an application to listen podcast though. That's it. That's why I prefer radio.
Okay.
Okay, one more time.
Okay.
One more question.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Have you okay Kak Divya, have you ever heard stories through the radio? For example, when I still a baby, my father and mother like to learn about Angling Dharma. For example, have you ever heard another stories from the radio? Thank you. Eh, and
What
how it feels for you for you. Okay, thank you.
I don't really get it, sir. What you mean? You mean is what kind of story?
Anything about anything, like jokes or horror or
Hmm.
romantic, whatever, anything or anything. Have you ever heard it, and how you feel it? How do you feel it?
Yeah, I
Uh,
ever heard
Bagaimana
about
rasanya?
it.
Gitu.
Yeah,
Mm.
I ever heard it once while listening to radio. It's like the broadcaster is asking for the listeners about the experience while working in one company, and then the listeners can what is it called, call to the phone number that is have mentioned by broadcaster. And then I listening to some stories from some listeners that sharing their experience while working in a company, and it feels like I can I it giving is it gives me one of I it gives me one inspiration, and it gives me like apa sih bayangan tuh, bayangan untuk bekerja suatu saat gitu loh, karena because of their experience, because of their because they are sharing about their experience, so I can also got some inspiration from their experience. So it's give me more what it is semangat atau apalah itu nyebutnya. Jadi saya kayak dapat inspirasi dan dapat bayangan dari cerita-cerita yang diungkapkan oleh para pendengar saat ditanyai sama penyiar radionya tentang pekerjaan-pekerjaan yang di kantor. Jadi saya dapat bayangan tentang pekerjaan itu semua. Gitu, Wak. I think it's enough to us to end this question and answer section.
Yes, yes. I think this time up. So maybe you can provide conclusion from today's material before the closing session.
Okay, today's conclusion is the material I present today is not meant to look for which one is better or comparing podcast with radio, because both can be enjoyed by anyone and anywhere. Both are equally beneficial for many people, and both have their own advantages and disadvantages. So we're all free to choose to keep listening to the radio or switch to the podcast. That's all.
Okay, thank you, Dhivya. Well, my task as a moderator has been completed. I'm Kalista Naira. I return it to Rangga as host.
Okay, thank you, Kalista. Wow, that was a great presentation from Divya. Sadly, this meeting had come to an end. So, from the materials that Divya already presented, I think you can already pick which ones you prefer between podcast and radio. The Q&A also running solidly because of the questions. So, okay, that's the end of today's meeting. You can leave the meeting. Thank you for joining. Oh yeah, don't forget to fill the questions with. Thank you. Bye bye.